Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review this controller here. It's called the BigBig Won Rainbow. And, as its name implies, the RGB lighting is front and center of this controller. Now, if you've watched this channel for some time, you know that I love reviewing third-party controllers. And I'm not really sure what draws me to them. Part of it might be the fact that they tend to be cheaper than first-party controllers. But I think another part of third-party controllers is the fact that they potentially could improve upon a first-party controller. After all, they basically take the mold from well-known controllers and then make small tweaks to them and potentially could make an improvement. And so that's what we're going to do in this video here. We're going to look at all the little tweaks that are part of this controller and whether or not it makes any sort of improvement upon the experience that you could get from just a controller you would buy at a big box store. And I think it's pretty obvious that this controller used a lot of the design language of the Xbox controllers, and so that's what we'll primarily compare it against. And we'll also take a look at compatibility and see specifically what things will work with this. And like with all things that I review, there are good and bad to anything. And so it's really just going to be a matter of whether or not some of the improvements they make are worth some of the missteps that they made along the way as well. So without any further delay, let's jump into this review. Now this device costs around $40 to $45. You can get it on both AliExpress and Amazon right now. The box is fairly simple. You can see here that it promotes the fact that it has 6-axis gyro controls, a headphone jack, as well as a 3-meter cord. Not a ton of info on the back here, but it does show that it connects wirelessly to an app via Bluetooth, which is kind of ironic because the device itself is not Bluetooth capable. This is a plug-in only controller, but we'll get more into that here in a minute. Let's check out what's inside the box. It does come with a pretty significant instruction manual, which is well written and easy to read. And it'll walk you through how to set up gyroscopic controls and macro functions, but I'll show you those in this video here too. Like I mentioned, this is a plug-in only controller. Luckily, the controller is pretty long. It's about 9 feet long. So let's take a look at the controller itself. First impressions is it's very glossy and shiny, and I like the fact that I can see inside of it. The plastic itself has no texture to it. It is very slick feeling, and that might be a good or a bad thing depending on how sweaty your hands get. On the back it does have a function button, plus a couple macro keys. We'll go over that in a minute. Overall, it feels a lot like a standard Xbox controller. The D-pad has a membrane feel to it. It's actually very good, much better than what I would expect from an Xbox controller. Face buttons feel almost exactly like an Xbox. As far as shoulders and triggers, the triggers thankfully are analog triggers, and they work really well. And the triggers are nice and light. They actually feel like they have more travel than a typical Xbox controller. Now this is all personal preference, but I really do like having translucent things like this. I like the ability to see how the mechanism works as I'm playing. Okay, so now let's talk about these macro keys on the back. They actually flick up and down in order to trigger the button itself. And honestly, I was a little skeptical of this even as I pulled it out of the box. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to make that flicking motion in the back of the controller like this. It's just something I'm not naturally used to. And because your index fingers are going to naturally rest on your triggers, that means you're going to use the middle fingers to actually do the flicking. And that definitely feels unnatural. It's definitely something that you're not going to be used to doing with your middle fingers. But we'll see how that works out when we start playing a game. Other than that, the ergonomics feel really good on this controller. So now let's plug it in and see what the lighting looks like. So it actually has several different color presets. The initial one will basically just cycle through the spectrum of RGB lighting. But if you double click on the function button on the back, it'll show you different options you have available. Some of them will show multicolor blends, or you can actually just focus on one specific color within the spectrum. Or if you double click it enough, you can actually just turn the colors off altogether. Now all of these things can actually be managed through an app on your phone, but honestly I don't like installing extra apps on my phone just for single functions like this. There's nothing that you can do on the app that you can't just do on the controller itself. So if you don't want to have extra apps on your phone, it's not necessary. So this controller works natively with the Nintendo Switch. You can just basically plug it right in and it's going to work perfectly. And the controls themselves, they're really good. In fact, I would call them unremarkable, but in a good way. In the fact that when I first plugged this controller in and started playing with it, it immediately felt natural to me. And that's a really good sign. This is a nice controller. The face buttons themselves feel really good. They're almost exactly like an Xbox controller. The analog sticks too, they feel nice and responsive. They have a lot of good travel to them. They feel good. So now let's mess around with some of the extra functions that are available on this controller. We'll start with the gyroscopic controls. What you do is you hold down the function button and then click down on L3. And that's going to turn on gyroscopic controls for the left analog stick. You can do the same with the right analog stick. And honestly, it's a little bit weird to get used to. For example, the way that I had to angle the controller to go up and down was the opposite what I expected. Anyway, to turn it off, you just hold down function and L3 again. Some other options available, you can actually turn on turbo for any button. What you do is you hold down the function button and then tap any of the other buttons. For example here, now I'm using the A button on turbo. And it works really well, and again, to turn it off, you just do the same thing. So now let's try these macro buttons. Like I mentioned before, I'm a little bit skeptical of these, but let's at least try flicking it in real life and see how it goes. And this is pretty easy to set up too. You'll hold down the function button for a few seconds and then hit the back button, and then you'll see like a pulsing blue light. After that, push whatever button or button sequence you want, and then push the back button again. So now I've set up the M1 button to be the A button. And just like that, when I flick it up, it's going to hit the A button. But as I suspected, it is a little bit awkward to use your ring finger to flick up like that. It might be useful in something like a first-person shooter as like a reload button, but I wouldn't use it as something that's really critical, like a jump button or something like that. Honestly, it's just a little bit awkward. So I wanted to try out another game using the gyroscopic controls, and for this I'm going to use Mario Kart 8. And to be honest, it functions a little bit better on this one because you don't have to worry about the up and down axis, mostly just the left and right. But all the same, it's not quite as sensitive as I was hoping it would be. In general, I definitely don't feel like I'm in more control of this than when I'm just using an analog stick or even a D-pad. And while I think it is a kind of neat gimmick to have that available, I honestly don't think I'll use this much at all. Okay, so now let's try out a different system. This time let's do PC, and this one also works natively, you just have to plug it right in. And honestly, these are the only two systems that work natively with this control, as we'll see here in a minute. But overall, it works really well as a PC controller. In fact, this is probably its best use. If you end up playing a lot of PC games, this might be your best fit. And part of that might be the fact that this is a wired controller, and it makes sense to have a wired controller with a PC because you typically are going to sit fairly close to the PC itself. Now, the PC and Switch are the only things that work natively with this controller, but you can get it to work on other things. But you're going to need help. You're going to need the R90 wired adapter. And I reviewed this in an earlier video, but basically this is a $20 adapter that'll allow you to increase your compatibility with other systems. Typically you would use this to play Xbox controllers on a PS4, but luckily when plugged into this adapter, the controller behaves as an Xbox controller, so it works. So let's test it out on a few systems. We'll start with the PS4. And it works really well. Basically, all you have to do is just plug it in with this adapter and it'll work right out of the box. And it is kind of cool to play an Xbox-style controller on a PS4, but honestly, if you already have an Xbox controller and you have the R90, you don't need this controller to do that. You can just use the R90. But either way, here's a confirmation that this controller will work on the PS4, and it works well. And it also works on Android devices. Here's the NVIDIA Shield TV, and it works really well. Okay, let's try something else. How about Batocera, which is a Linux-based operating system, and as you can see here, it's working really well. You're going to need the R90 adapter, but once you plug it in, it basically behaves like an Xbox controller. Now let's try out one other system. Here is Emulec. This is also a Linux-based operating system that works on a lot of Android boxes, and as you can see here, it's working really well. So if you own something like, say, the Super Console X, or you have the NVIDIA Shield, or a PC that runs Batocera, you're going to be able to use any of those with this controller. And honestly, the D-pad on this is really nice. It does feel a lot better than most first-party controllers. I would rather use this than, say, any Xbox controller or a PS4 controller. Now, the Rainbow is not the first controller made by BigBig Won. The Elitist S is actually their first controller, and I really like this one. It has some unique functions to it. For example, it is wireless. You can use either Bluetooth or a USB dongle to connect wirelessly to a device. Very handy. It also has these two paddles on the back which are programmable, and they're really nice to use. They're nice and clicky. Really, the only big drawback of this controller is the fact that it doesn't have analog triggers. So it works really well on the Switch, but not a lot of other systems that actually support analog controls. Something like GameCube wouldn't work well with this. When holding either of these devices, the Rainbow really stands out for how slick it feels. If you have sweaty hands, you're probably not going to enjoy this that much. But all the same, I played this for several hours and it never became an issue for me. And it's missing a few of the other features of the Elitist S. For example, it's not wireless, and you'll have to use an adapter if you're going to use it for anything but a Nintendo Switch or a PC. So in wrapping up, what do I think about this controller? Well, honestly, I like the unique look of it. I like this RGB lighting, and I do like that it's translucent. It's a pretty unique controller. But I can understand how it wouldn't be for everyone, and honestly it has quite a few drawbacks too. For example, these macro buttons on the back, they're just a little bit weird. I don't see myself using them in a real life scenario. And there's no denying the fact that a wired controller does really well when it comes to latency, but all the same, in this wireless world, it does feel like a bit of a drawback. That being said, the lack of batteries in this controller do make it very lightweight. Overall, if I was going to make a recommendation for somebody about this controller, I would say it works really well as a PC controller. I think the RGB lighting does lend itself to PC gaming, and it is a versatile controller. You can use this for any number of functions, emulation and PC gaming primarily. That being said, if you want to play it on something like Batocera or Emulec, you do have to pay a premium because you have to pay an additional $20 to have this adapter that'll allow you to use those systems. And honestly, that's kind of a bummer, unless you planned on getting an R90 in the first place, this does feel like a kind of frivolous thing to buy. So, if you're a PC gamer, I think this is a good fit. For everybody else, I would say maybe explore other options. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and we'll see you next time. Happy gaming.